There's an experiment called Rat Park that changed how scientists think about addiction. In the 1970s, the standard addiction research model involved putting a rat alone in a small cage with 2 water bottles. One contained plain water, one contained water laced with heroin or cocaine. The rats would almost universally choose the drug water. They'd keep choosing it until they died. This was taken as proof that certain substances were so powerfully addictive that exposure was essentially a death sentence. Then Bruce Alexander at Simon Fraser University had a different idea. What if the cage was the problem? He built Rat Park, a large enclosure with tunnels and platforms and wheels and plenty of food and, most importantly, other rats of rat society. Then he offered the same 2 water bottles. The rats in Rat Park mostly chose plain water. Even rats who had been forcibly addicted through weeks of isolation and then placed in Rat Park significantly reduced their drug consumption. The social environment, the stimulation, the connection, these things changed the equation completely. The conclusion Alexander drew was radical and uncomfortable. Addiction isn't primarily about the drug, it's primarily about the cage. The neuroscience of addiction starts with dopamine, not in the way it's usually described. Dopamine isn't the pleasure chemical. That's a simplification that's gotten a lot of people confused. Dopamine is more accurately the anticipation chemical, the wanting chemical. It's released in response to cues that predict reward, not in response to the reward itself. This is why addiction is so hard to shake, even when the substance stops being pleasurable. The drug has hijacked the dopamine system. It's conditioned the brain to release massive anticipatory dopamine in response to cues, the smell of alcohol, the sight of a lighter, the neighborhood where you used to score. The wanting is there even when the liking is gone. Even when the person genuinely doesn't want to use anymore. The craving isn't a choice. It's a conditioned neurological response that happens before the conscious mind has any input. Nora Volkow at the National Institute on Drug Abuse has spent decades imaging the brains of people with addiction. What she finds consistently is that addiction is associated with reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control, planning, weighing consequences, making the kind of rational decisions that willpower is supposed to produce. So the standard advice, just decide to stop, just use willpower, just make better choices, is asking the part of the brain most damaged by the addiction to override the part of the brain most activated by it. It's like telling someone with a broken leg to just walk it off. The ACE study is one of the most important pieces of research in understanding why some people develop addiction and some don't. ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. The study followed 17,000 people and found that childhood trauma, abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, parental incarceration dramatically increased the likelihood of addiction in adulthood. Not slightly dramatically. A person with 4 or more adverse childhood experiences is 5 times more likely to develop alcoholism and 46 times more likely to become an injection drug user than someone with no adverse experiences. So 46 times, that number doesn't fit a narrative about weak people making bad choices. That number describes a wound that gets carried forward, a nervous system that learned early that the world was unsafe and that found eventually a chemical that made the unsafety bearable. Johann Hari spent 3 years researching addiction for his book, Chasing the Scream, and arrived at a conclusion that rhymes with Alexander's Rat Park finding. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, the opposite of addiction is connection. The people who recover from addiction most durably are the ones who rebuild connection to other people, to work that matters, to a sense of future, to a story about themselves that isn't defined by the addiction. The 12-step programs have been criticized extensively for their lack of empirical support for some of their specific mechanisms. But what they undeniably do is create community, a room full of people who know what you've been through, accountability, connection, which might be why they help some people even when the theoretical framework is disputed. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001, not just marijuana, all drugs, heroin, cocaine, everything. Instead of arresting people for possession, they retracted them to health and social services. They invested the money saved on prosecution and incarceration into treatment and community support programs. The results confounded everyone who predicted disaster. Drug use in Portugal did not increase dramatically. HIV infections among drug users plummeted. Drug-related deaths fell. The proportion of drug offenders in prison fell from 44% to 24%. What happened was that treating addiction as a health problem rather than a moral failing produced better outcomes on every metric than treating it as a crime. That policy has been running for over 20 years now. The data is clear. The rest of the world has been slow to catch up. What I find most important about the science of addiction is what it implies about the people caught in it.
Yeah.
The person who can't stop isn't weak. They have a brain that has been physically altered by substance use, operating in an environment that may not provide the connection and meaning that would make sobriety viable, carrying forward wounds that nobody chose to inflict and nobody helped them heal. That's not an excuse for harm caused. Addiction causes real damage to real people, but understanding the mechanism changes the response. Shame and punishment don't fix altered dopamine systems. They deepen the isolation that made the cage in the first place. The body you're in right now is doing something remarkable without any substance, without any chemical intervention. It's producing its own neurochemical shift, melatonin, adenosine, a natural cascade that produces something as good as anything in a bottle. The system works. It's working right now. You don't need anything you don't already have. A rest now? The word universe used to mean everything. The totality of existence, all of space, all of time, all of matter and energy. Yeah. The universe was, by definition, the complete set of everything that is. And then physics started producing theories that didn't fit inside that definition anymore. Theories that required something beyond the observable universe, something beyond even the unobservable universe, multiple universes, an ensemble of realities, each as real as this one, running in parallel, branching, inflating, existing in dimensions we have no access to. The multiverse. And the strange thing is, it didn't come from science fiction, it came from the math. Multiple independent lines of theoretical physics converged on the same uncomfortable conclusion, that our universe might not be the only one. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is probably the most discussed version. Hugh Everett proposed it in 1957 as a doctoral thesis at Princeton, and it was largely ignored for decades. Now it's taken seriously by a significant fraction of physicists. The basic idea is that the wave function, the mathematical description of a quantum system, never collapses. In standard quantum mechanics, when you measure a particle, it collapses from a superposition of possible states into one definite state. Everett said that's wrong. Instead, every possible outcome happens. The universe branches in one branch, the particle went left, and another branch, it went right. Both branches are equally real. Every quantum event that could have gone differently branches the universe, every radioactive decay, every photon interaction, every measurement at every scale, constantly branching, constantly proliferating. If this is right, the number of branches is so large, it has no meaningful expression in human language. And in each branch, there is a version of you that experienced the outcome of that branch, an almost infinite number of yous diverging at every quantum fork in an almost infinite number of universes. String theory produces a different kind of multiverse. The math of string theory requires extra dimensions beyond the four we experience. 3 spatial and 1 temporal, depending on how those extra dimensions are compactified, how they're folded up at scales too small to observe. You get different physics, different physical constants, different laws of nature. And the number of possible configurations is staggering. The estimate is around 10 to the power of 500, a number so large that writing it out in standard notation would require more digits than there are atoms in the observable universe. Each configuration would be a different universe with different physics. The landscape of string theory is a space of all possible universes, each with its own constants, its own laws, its own possibility space for what can exist. Ours is one point in that landscape, one configuration out of an incomprehensible number. The eternal inflation model is cosmological rather than quantum. Alan Guth's inflation theory says that in the very early universe, space underwent a period of exponential expansion, doubling in size unimaginably fast for a fraction of a second. This solved several problems in standard cosmology. Andre Lindy extended it into eternal inflation, the idea that inflation doesn't stop everywhere at once, it stops locally, creating what we call a universe, a bubble of stable space with its own physical constants, but elsewhere, inflation keeps going, perpetually generating new bubbles, new universes, a vast foam of bubble universes, each separated from the others by eternally inflating space, each potentially with different physics, none of them accessible to any of the others. Our universe is one bubble surrounded by space that is still inflating, new bubbles forming, constantly, each potentially becoming a universe with different constants, different structures, different possibilities. The anthropic principle is interesting in this context. The physical constants of our universe are remarkably finely tuned for the existence of complex matter. Change the strength of gravity slightly, and stars either collapse immediately or never ignite. Change the ratio of electromagnetic to gravitational force, and atoms can't form. The cosmological constant, the energy of empty space, is tuned to 1 part in 10 to the power of 120. If it were different by that much, the universe would either have collapsed or expanded too fast for anything to form. The standard explanation for this fine-tuning used to be that it required a designer. The multiverse offers an alternative. If there are an enormous number of universes with different constants, then by definition we find ourselves in one where the constants allow for our existence. We couldn't observe a universe where we couldn't exist. The fine-tuning isn't design, it's selection bias. We're here because the constants allow us to be in the universes where they don't. Nobody is asking the question. The honest scientific position is that the multiverse is currently untestable. You can't reach another universe. You can't detect one. The predictions it makes that could in principle be tested, bubble universe collisions leaving imprints on the cosmic microwave background radiation, haven't been definitively confirmed. Some physicists think untestable theories aren't science, that the multiverse is metaphysics dressed in mathematical clothing. Others think the dismissal is premature, that the theories are so well supported in what they do predict that their untestable implications deserve serious consideration, that absence of evidence from something we have no means to detect isn't evidence of absence. What I find most interesting about the multiverse is what it does to the concept of possibility. In a single universe, everything that didn't happen is just absent. The road's not taken lead nowhere, the choices not made are simply gone. In a multiverse, every possibility that quantum mechanics allows actually happens somewhere. The road not taken leads somewhere, the choice not made was made by another version of you in another branch, living a life that diverged at that moment. Whether or not it's true, it's a strange thing to sit with. Right now in this branch of whatever the universe is, you're here. Warm still, the breathing slow, whatever other versions of this moment exist elsewhere, if they exist at all, this one is yours. Just this one, just now, a rest in it. Sharks are older than trees. That sentence takes a moment to land properly. Trees evolved around 350 million years ago. Sharks have been swimming in the oceans for around 450 million years. When the first forests were spreading across the land surface of this planet, sharks had already been perfecting their design for 100 million years. They survived the Permian extinction, the worst mass extinction in Earth's history, which wiped out 96% of all marine species. They survived the extinction event that killed the dinosaurs. They have outlasted every mass extinction this planet has thrown at them for nearly 500 million years. And in that time, their basic design has barely changed. The great white shark looks remarkably similar to sharks from tens of millions of years ago because the design works evolution found a solution so effective that there was nothing to improve. The sensory package a shark carries is extraordinary and largely invisible from the surface. The lateral line system runs along both sides of the body and detects pressure changes in the water. A struggling fish 50 meters away creates pressure waves the shark reads like text. It knows the direction, the distance, the erratic quality of the movement that suggests injury. The ampullae of Lorenzini are gel-filled pores concentrated around the snout that detect electrical fields. Every living thing generates a weak bioelectric field from muscle activity. A shark can detect fields as weak as 5 billionths of a volt per centimeter. It can find a fish buried in sand by the electrical signature of its heartbeat. It has 7 rows of teeth that rotate forward as the front ones are lost, producing around 30,000 teeth over a lifetime. It never runs out. And the olfactory system, the portion of a shark's brain devoted to smell, is proportionally larger than in almost any other animal. They can detect blood at concentrations of 1 part per million. In practical terms, that's a few drops in an Olympic swimming pool. These aren't adaptations cobbled together from available parts. This is a predator that has been refined by selection pressure over 450 million years into something close to a perfect detection and attack system. The megalodon is worth talking about because it represents what the shark body plan looks like when you scale it up to the limits of what the ocean can support. A megalodon went extinct around 3.6 million years ago. Estimates of its size vary, but the most credible range from 15 to 20 meters. For comparison, the largest reliably measured great white was just over 6 meters. The megalodon's teeth, which are the primary fossil evidence, since cartilage doesn't preserve well, are the size of a human hand. It ate whales, not small whales, large baleen whales. Fossil whale bones from the megalodon era show bite marks and impact trauma consistent with attacks from something enormous. Bite force estimates put it somewhere around 40,000 pounds per square inch, roughly 10 times the bite force of a great white. There are people online who insist megalodon still exists in the deep ocean. It doesn't, we know this, because it ate large surface-dwelling whales, and we would see the evidence. What's interesting is that the deep ocean is unexplored enough that the idea is at least entertaining. The great white shark's hunting strategy is more sophisticated than most people realize.
Yeah.
They don't just swim around and bite things. They study great whites in areas like the Farallon Islands off San Francisco, have been observed positioning themselves at depth below seal colonies and learning the silhouettes of individual seals, distinguishing between healthy seals and injured or juvenile ones waiting. They attack from below using the sun to backlight the surface and make their approach harder to detect. The attack is fast. A great white can accelerate to around 40 kilometers per hour in short bursts, and the initial bite is often followed by a release and waiting. The shark retreats while the prey weakens from blood loss, then returns. This is not mindless predation. This is strategy. Sharks are critical to ocean ecosystems in ways that aren't obvious until they're removed. When sharks are removed from a reef system, the mid-level predators they normally control, rays for example, explode in population. Those mid-level predators then devastate the smaller fish and shellfish populations below them, which affects the algae those smaller fish control, which affects the coral the algae depends on. The removal of one apex predator can collapse an entire ecosystem from the top down. There are reef systems around the world right now in various states of this collapse because shark populations have been decimated by finning and bycatch. We're removing 450 million years of ecological engineering because we find them frightening and because shark fin soup is considered a delicacy. The fear of sharks is one of the most disproportionate fears humans carry. Around 10 people globally die from shark attacks each year. You're more likely to be killed by a vending machine, by a lawnmower, by a cow, by lightning multiple times over. The fear isn't rational, it's visceral. It taps into something ancient in the human nervous system, the open water, the unknown beneath you. The thing that might be looking up from that ancient fear is real, even when the statistical threat isn't. There's something I find deeply compelling about an animal that has existed for 450 million years, that has watched continents move, that swam in oceans that existed before the first land animals crawled out of the water. It doesn't know any of that. It just swims, hunts, has done exactly this for longer than we have words for. The patience of deep time, the ocean doing what the ocean has always done. The darkness outside right now, the quiet, something ancient and patient in it, not threatening, just old, just doing what it's always done. A rest now, the deep carries its own kind of peace. There's an organism in Oregon that covers 2,385 acres. It lives mostly underground. It has been growing for somewhere between 2,000 and 8,000 years. It weighs an estimated 35,000 tons. It is a single individual. It's a fungus, Armillaria ostoye, the honey mushroom. What you see above ground, the mushrooms that appear seasonally, are just the fruiting bodies. The organism itself is a vast network of filaments called mycelium threading through the soil across an area larger than 1,600 football fields. It is the largest known living organism on Earth, and most people have never heard of it. Fungi are not plants. They're not animals. They occupy their own kingdom, a branch of life so distinct from both that classifying them took centuries of argument and required the development of molecular biology to settle. Genetically, fungi are actually more closely related to animals than to plants. We share a common ancestor with them that plants don't. They eat by secreting enzymes into their surroundings and absorbing the digested nutrients. They have no chlorophyll, no photosynthesis, no leaves or roots in the plant sense. They build cell walls from chitin, the same material, in insect exoskeletons rather than cellulose. They exist in almost every environment on Earth, in soil, in wood, in water, in living organisms, in the walls of your house, in your gut, on your skin. The total biomass of fungi on Earth is estimated to be around 10 times the total biomass of all land animals combined. They are everywhere and mostly invisible. The mycelium network is what makes fungi genuinely strange. Mycelium is a web of thread-like filaments called hyphae, each only a few micrometers wide, that extend through soil and wood and organic matter in search of nutrients. These filaments branch and fuse and branch again, creating networks of extraordinary complexity and reach. Merlin Sheldrake, who has spent his career studying fungi, describes mycelium as a way of being in the world that has no analog in animal life. It has no center, no brain, no hierarchy decisions. If you can call them that, emerge from the network as a whole. When one part of the mycelium encounters a nutrient source, the information propagates through the network chemically, and the whole organism reorients. It's a kind of distributed intelligence that solves problems without anything doing the solving. The Wood Wide Web is the name researchers gave to the discovery that forest trees communicate and share resources through fungal networks. The mycorrhizal fungi that colonize tree roots don't just feed on the tree, they form a genuine symbiosis. The fungus extends its network far beyond where the tree's roots can reach, accessing nutrients and water the tree can't get alone, and trading them for sugars the tree produces through photosynthesis. But the network does more than facilitate trade. It transmits signals. When a tree is attacked by insects, it releases chemical signals through the mycelium that neighboring trees receive and respond to by ramping up their own chemical defenses before the insects reach them. The network transmits distress signals. It transfers carbon from trees with surplus to shaded seedlings that are struggling. Suzanne Simard at the University of British Columbia has documented what she calls mother trees, large hub trees that transfer disproportionate resources through the network to their own offspring and to struggling neighbors. A forest isn't a collection of competing individuals, it's a community connected by a network that's been described by multiple researchers as having functional similarities to a nervous system. Fungi are the primary decomposers on Earth. Without them, dead organic matter would simply accumulate. Forests would be buried under their own debris within decades. Nutrients locked in dead wood and leaves would never return to the soil. When a tree dies, the fungi begin. The mycelium penetrates the wood, secretes enzymes that break down lignin and cellulose, the structural materials of plants that almost nothing else can digest, and slowly returns the tree's substance to the soil, where it becomes available to new growth. The fungus is not destroying the tree, it's completing the cycle. It's the mechanism by which death becomes life again. Paul Stamets has been arguing for decades that fungi have applications we've barely begun to explore. He's documented fungal species that can break down petroleum, absorb radioactive cesium, produce compounds that kill viruses, and reduce populations of carpenter ants, termites, and other insects without pesticides. After Chernobyl, certain fungi were found growing around the reactor, apparently using radiation as an energy source the way plants use sunlight. Melanin in their cell walls appears to absorb gamma radiation and convert it into chemical energy. Radiotrophic fungi, the mechanisms aren't fully understood, the phenomenon is real. Fungi have been solving biochemical problems for hundreds of millions of years. The library of solutions they've developed is vast, and we've barely started reading it. Scenario psilocybin, which we talked about in a previous episode in the context of therapy, comes from fungi. The compounds that have shown the most extraordinary results in treating depression, PTSD, addiction, they were synthesized by mushrooms for reasons that are not entirely clear as part of a biochemical ecology we don't fully understand. The mushroom didn't develop psilocybin for humans. Humans encountered mushrooms that had already developed psilocybin for their own reasons, and those compounds turned out to interact with the human nervous system in ways that may be medically significant. The forest has been running its own pharmaceutical research program for a very long time. Right under where you're lying right now, beneath the building, beneath the concrete, somewhere in the soil below, there are fungal networks doing what they've done for 450 million years.
Threading through the dark, connecting, exchanging, completing cycles too slow to see.
The hidden life of the world going on underneath everything. Patient, persistent, necessary. The dark isn't empty. It's full of things working quietly. Just like you are right now. A rest now? There is a crow in a laboratory in New Zealand named Betty. In 2002, Betty was given a task. A small bucket of food was placed at the bottom of a vertical tube. To get the food, she needed a hook. She was given a choice of 2 pieces of wire, one straight, one already bent into a hook. A second crow took the bent wire before Betty could use it. Betty was left with the straight piece. Researchers watched, expecting her to give up or try unsuccessfully to fish out the food with a straight wire. Instead, Betty took the straight wire, wedged one end under the edge of a tray, and bent it into a hook. She did this spontaneously without being trained to do it, without having seen it done. She encountered a problem, assessed what she had available, and fabricated a tool to solve it. Tool fabrication, the spontaneous creation of a new tool to solve a novel problem. Before Betty, this was considered an exclusively human capability with possible extension to great apes. Betty was a bird with a brain the size of a walnut. The corvid family, crows, ravens, jays, magpies, has been producing results like this for decades, and the scientific community has been slowly recalibrating what it thought it knew about animal intelligence. The assumption was that intelligence scaled with brain size and that the critical factor was the neocortex, the outer layer of the mammalian brain associated with higher cognition. Birds don't have a neocortex. Their brains are organized completely differently from mammalian brains. What researchers found when they looked more carefully is that birds have a region called the pallium that performs analogous functions to the neocortex. Through a completely different architecture, evolution arrived at something like higher cognition through a completely different route. The corvid brain is not a simplified version of the mammalian brain. It's a different solution to the same problem. A raven's plan for the future. This sounds unremarkable until you consider that future planning requires holding a representation of a situation that doesn't yet exist, evaluating possible actions against that future state, and selecting behavior now based on anticipated consequences. Researchers at Lund University gave ravens a task where they had to use a tool to open a box to get food. The tool and the box were presented separately at different times. Ravens would reliably select and keep the tool during a waiting period, sometimes overnight, in order to use it later to get the food. They were holding a future situation in mind and acting in the present to prepare for it. This is the cognitive operation underlying human planning, and it was happening in a bird brain. Crows recognize individual human faces, and they hold grudges. John Marsloff at the University of Washington demonstrated this by having researchers wear specific masks while capturing and banding crows. A stressful experience for the birds. Afterward, crows would scold and dive bomb people wearing those specific masks for years. They taught other crows which masks were dangerous. Young crows who had never been captured would scold the masks because they'd learned the association from adults. The knowledge of which humans were dangerous propagated through the crow community across generations. Yeah. There are people in Seattle who participated in those studies who still get scolded by crows years later when they wear the masks. The crows haven't forgotten. The crows haven't forgiven. The social complexity of corvid groups appears to drive a lot of their intelligence. Ravens live in complex dominance hierarchies with shifting alliances. They track who is allied with whom. They track who has seen them cache food and will move their caches if they've been observed, but only if the observer is actually a competitor. They don't bother if the observer has no interest in their food. This requires a theory of mind, an understanding that other individuals have their own knowledge, their own interests, their own perspectives. A raven deciding whether to move a food cache is modeling what another raven knows and wants. Theory of mind was once considered uniquely human, then it was extended cautiously to great apes. It is now demonstrably present in ravens. Or a raven's play, not play in the sense of practicing survival skills, genuine play. They slide down snowy rooftops repeatedly with no apparent purpose. Other than that, it seems enjoyable. They play tug of war with sticks. They dangle from branches upside down. They cache objects that have no food value and retrieve them later. Play for its own sake is associated with complex cognition. The brain has to have enough excess capacity beyond immediate survival needs to spend energy on purposeless activity. Play is a sign of a mind with room to spare. What gets me most is the mourning behavior. Corvids gather around their dead. When a crow dies, other crows will congregate around the body, sometimes in large numbers, staying for extended periods. They bring objects, food sticks, other small items, and leave them near the body. They go quiet, then they disperse. Researchers studying this think it may serve a social learning function, understanding what killed this crow, learning about dangers. That's probably part of it. But the behavior also looks like something else. It looks like grief, like acknowledgement, like the community marking that something that was here is now gone. Whether it is grief in the way we experience grief, whether there is something, it is like to be a crow standing over another crow's body. We can't know for certain. But the behavior is real, and it's harder to dismiss than it used to be. Outside right now, somewhere in the trees, there are corvids roosting, settled in for the night, doing whatever they do in the dark between one day and the next. Their brains running on some version of the same process as yours is running on. perception, memory, anticipation, social calculation, scenario A, different architecture, the same ancient drive to navigate a complicated world. You have more in common with them than you might think. Arrest now? The night belongs to both of you. The FBI's behavioral science unit was started in the 1970s by two agents named Robert Ressler and John Douglas, who had a simple and radical idea. Instead of waiting for serial killers to be caught and then studying them, why not go into prisons and interview the ones already caught? Build a database, look for patterns, try to understand what these people actually were rather than what mythology said they were. They drove around the country in a government car visiting maximum security prisons and sitting down with some of the most violent people in American history. Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Charles Manson, Edmund Kemper, Richard Speck. They asked about childhood, about fantasy, about the mechanics of what they'd done and why. What they found was simultaneously illuminating and deeply uncomfortable, because what they found was not monsters, not in the sense of beings fundamentally different from the rest of humanity. What they found was a recognizable developmental trajectory that started early, escalated slowly, and arrived at catastrophe through a series of steps that each made a terrible kind of sense. The McDonald triad was an early attempt to identify childhood warning signs: bedwetting past a certain age, fire starting, and cruelty to animals. The theory was that these three behaviors in combination predicted violent adults. It turned out to be too simple. The research support for the specific triad is weak. What the research does support is something broader: childhood trauma, specifically the combination of neurological vulnerability and severe early abuse or neglect. Not everyone with a difficult childhood becomes violent. The vast majority don't. But the backgrounds of people who commit serial violence are overwhelmingly characterized by abuse, chaos, abandonment, and the absence of any stable attachment figure. James Fallon is a neuroscientist who studies the brains of psychopaths. He found the characteristic orbital cortex patterns in a set of brain scans he was using as controls, only to discover they were scans of his own family members, including himself. He has the brain of a psychopath. He grew up in a warm, stable, loving family. He became a successful scientist. His conclusion was that the neurology loads the gun, the environment pulls the trigger, or doesn't. The fantasy life is what distinguishes the psychology of serial violence from other forms of violent crime. Most violence is impulsive, a fight that escalated, a moment of rage, a robbery gone wrong. Serial violence is planned, rehearsed, anticipated. The FBI interviews revealed that all of the killers they studied had rich fantasy lives that preceded and accompanied their crimes, detailed, specific, elaborated fantasies that they had been developing for years, sometimes decades, before they acted on them. The actual crime was, in some sense, an attempt to realize a fantasy that had been running internally for a very long time. What this means is that the violence didn't come from nowhere. It emerged from a private internal world that had been growing in isolation, never interrupted by relationship or reality, fed by whatever experiences and exposures confirmed and elaborated it. Edmund Kemper is one of the most studied cases because he is also one of the most articulate. He has an IQ of 145. He gave extensive interviews to the FBI and to journalists over decades, and his self-analysis is unsettlingly coherent. He described the development of his fantasy life in detail, the progression from imagining harm to elaborating it to acting it out on small animals to planning and eventually executing violence against people. He described the fantasies as something that felt necessary, that the internal pressure built until it required release. He also described with apparent genuine feeling the horror of what he'd done. He turned himself in. He called the police after his final crime. He has reportedly said he hopes he is never released. The coexistence of that self-awareness with the history is one of the things that makes his case so philosophically disorienting. The clean monster narrative is comforting because it puts serial killers in a category apart from the rest of humanity. They're different, they're other. We couldn't become that, and we couldn't have produced that. The research suggests something more uncomfortable, that the distance between the worst human behavior and the average is not a gap between different kinds of beings, but a continuum shaped by neurology and experience and environment, that what looks like a different species is more accurately the extreme end of a distribution. Philip Zimbardo, who ran the famous Stanford prison experiment, spent his career studying how ordinary people commit atrocities. His conclusion was that the situation matters more than the character, that good people can do terrible things under the right conditions, and terrible people exist partly because they were shaped by conditions that most people are lucky enough never to encounter. That doesn't excuse, it explains, and explanations matter if you want to prevent. The behavioral science unit's work eventually became the foundation of criminal profiling, the attempt to infer characteristics of an unknown offender from the evidence at the crime scene. It's been dramatized extensively, and the dramatized version is more reliable and more dramatic than the real one. What the real work did was shift how law enforcement thought about this category of crime, from random, inexplicable evil to something patterned, developmental, potentially predictable, which meant potentially interruptible earlier in the developmental trajectory before the fantasy calcifies and the threshold for action drops. There are people who might have been reached. Most of them weren't, but the possibility exists, and that possibility depends on taking the psychology seriously rather than dismissing it as incomprehensible. The human mind contains extraordinary range, extraordinary capacity for cruelty, and extraordinary capacity for love, and everything in between. And most people never encounter the circumstances that would reveal which end of their range they're capable of reaching. That's worth a moment of quiet gratitude.
Not for being special.
So for being lucky. Arrest now, the night is safe. You are safe. The marathon distance is 42.2 kilometers. It comes from a story, probably apocryphal, about a Greek soldier named Pheidippides who ran from the battlefield at Marathon to Athens to announce a military victory, delivered his message, and dropped dead. Whether that story is true or not, the distance it produced turns out to be almost precisely at the limit of what the human body can sustain through running before the physiological systems that makes running possible begin to catastrophically fail. That proximity to the limit is not a coincidence. It's why the marathon is the marathon. It's why finishing one means something that finishing a 10-kilometer race doesn't. The body at mile 26 is doing something fundamentally different from the body at mile 6. Something is happening in there that has no equivalent in ordinary life. The first thing the marathon does is deplete glycogen. Glycogen is the form in which your muscles and liver store carbohydrates, the primary fuel for sustained aerobic exercise. An average person stores around 2,000 calories worth of glycogen. Running a marathon burns somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 calories. The math is straightforward, somewhere around mile 18 to 22. The timing varies by pace and body composition and how well the runner fueled beforehand. The glycogen runs out. This is called hitting the wall, and people who have experienced it describe it with a consistency and specificity that makes it clear they're describing a real physiological event rather than just fatigue. The legs stop responding the way they should. They feel like they're made of something heavier than muscle. Coordination degrades. The simple, repetitive motion of running that was automatic for the previous 3 hours suddenly requires conscious effort and deliberate focus. The brain, which is also heavily glycogen dependent, starts to fog. Decision-making becomes labored. Emotional regulation collapses. Runners crying at mile 22 is not rare and not psychological weakness. It's neurochemistry. The body's response to glycogen depletion is to switch fuel sources. Fat oxidation ramps up. The problem is that fat oxidation is significantly less efficient than glycogen metabolism. It produces less energy per unit of oxygen consumed, which means the pace that felt sustainable on glycogen is no longer sustainable on fat. Everything slows, the engine is still running, but on a lower grade fuel. Elite marathon runners are distinguished partly by their ability to store more glycogen and partly by their ability to use fat at higher intensities to push the wall further down the course. Eliud Kipchoge breaking 2 hours in the marathon was in part a story about extreme metabolic efficiency, about a human body that had been trained over decades to do something at the boundary of what human physiology permits. The muscular damage is significant and accumulates throughout the race. Every foot strike, and there are around 30,000 of them in a marathon, creates microtears in the muscle fibers. The quads take the most punishment, especially on downhills where they're working eccentrically, contracting while lengthening to control the descent. The inflammation from this accumulating damage is part of what causes the specific deadness in the legs late in the race. After the race, the damage continues to manifest. Most runners experience peak soreness, not immediately, but around 48 hours later, a phenomenon called delayed onset muscle soreness. The body's inflammatory response to the muscle damage peaks in the day or two after the event. The immune system is significantly suppressed in the window immediately after a marathon. The physiological stress of the event is extreme enough. that the immune system temporarily deprioritizes its normal functions. Runners are unusually vulnerable to illness in the days after a race. The open window effect, the period of immune suppression, can last anywhere from 3 to 72 hours. The brain changes significantly during a marathon. Serotonin levels rise steadily as the race progresses. This contributes to the mood effects. Many runners describe the sense of calm focus in the middle miles, the emotional ability in the later miles. Endorphins release in response to sustained pain and exertion. Beta endorphin levels in marathon runners are significantly elevated by the finish. The runner's high is real in the sense that it's a measurable neurochemical state. It's also not universal. Not every runner experiences it, and among those who do it varies in intensity and timing. Some people feel it during the race, some feel it after, some never feel it at all. What almost every runner does feel at the finish is something distinct from ordinary accomplishment, something that seems disproportionate to the event. There's a quality to it that people who've experienced it struggle to explain to people who haven't. It might be the combination of neurochemicals. It might be the specific character of having pushed to a genuine physiological limit and kept going. It might be both. Fauja Singh ran the Toronto Waterfront Marathon in 2011 in 8 hours and 25 minutes. He was 100 years old. He is the oldest person ever to complete a marathon. When asked why he ran marathons at 100 years old, he said that God had given him legs and he intended to use them. The marathon is accessible to almost anyone willing to train for it. The finish line looks the same whether you cross it in 2 hours or 8. The physiological journey is the same. The wall is the same wall. The depletion is the same depletion. What changes is the time you spend on the road before you get there. Your body right now is doing its own long, slow thing. Not a marathon, but the same basic principle of physiological process that runs on its own schedule that can't be rushed, that requires you to trust the system and get out of the way. So sleep is its own kind of endurance event. You don't have to run it. You just have to let it carry you. The body knows the distance. It's been running this course every night of your life. Trust it. In 1912, a Polish book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich purchased a collection of manuscripts from a Jesuit college in Italy. Most of them were unremarkable. One was a handwritten illustrated book of around 240 pages. The illustrations were strange botanical drawings of plants that don't exist, naked figures in green pools connected by elaborate pipe systems, astronomical diagrams that don't correspond to any known system. And the text was in a script nobody had ever seen. A flowing, apparently deliberate writing system with its own consistent internal patterns, repeated characters, consistent word lengths, letter combinations that followed rules but completely unreadable. A scenario in over 100 years of cryptographic analysis by some of the best code breakers in the world, including teams that cracked Nazi and Soviet codes during World War II. Nobody has decoded the Voynich manuscript. It remains the most famous unsolved code in history. The attempts to decode it are almost as interesting as the manuscript itself. Every few years, someone announces a breakthrough medieval Latin encoded in a polyalphabetic cipher, proto-Romance language, constructed philosophical language, hoax, Arabic, Hebrew with abbreviations. The announcements generate headlines, and then the methodology gets examined and falls apart. The problem is statistical. The Voynich text has statistical properties consistent with a natural language. The frequency distribution of characters follows Zipf's law, which describes how frequently words appear in natural languages. This suggests it's not random noise, but it's also unlike any known language. The vocabulary is unusually large for a medieval manuscript. Certain characters appear in certain positions within words with a consistency that suggests grammatical rules. But what the rules are, what the characters mean, what language, if any underlies it, unknown. Some researchers think it might be a constructed language, an invented system created by the author. Some think it's a steganographic hoax designed to look like a language without being one. Some think it's a real language encoded in a cipher we haven't cracked. A small number think it might be glossolalia, the kind of flowing nonsense writing produced in certain spiritual states that coincidentally has language-like statistical properties. None of these explanations is settled. Carbon dating puts the vellum, the prepared animal skin the manuscript is written on, at between 1404 and 1438. The inks and pigments are consistent with that period. Whoever wrote it did so in the early 15th century. The ownership history before Voynich is uncertain, but one letter found with the manuscript suggests it was at some point owned by Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, who reportedly paid 600 gold ducats for it, an enormous sum that suggests he believed it to be something significant. Rudolph was known for collecting esoteric manuscripts. He apparently thought this one was worth the equivalent of a small fortune. Whatever it contained, whoever wrote it, it was considered valuable enough that someone paid an extraordinary price to possess it. The Zodiac Killer sent coded messages to San Francisco newspapers in 1969. He claimed the messages contained his identity. 3 of the 4 ciphers he sent have been solved. The most recent, a 340-character message, was cracked in 2020 by a team of amateur codebreakers working collaboratively online. It took 51 years. The 4th cipher, known as Z13, has 13 characters and has not been decoded. It may contain the killer's name. It may be unsolvable with available information. The Zodiac Killer was never identified, and Z13 remains open. The Beale ciphers are 3 texts published in 1885 that allegedly describe the location of a buried treasure in Virginia, gold and silver worth millions of dollars. One of the 3 has been decoded using the Declaration of Independence as a key. It describes the general location of the treasure and the names of those entitled to it. The other 2, the precise location and the names of the depositors, have not been decoded despite over a century of attempts. Either the treasure is there, the ciphers are real, and nobody has found the key, or the entire thing is an elaborate hoax, and the decoded cipher was planted to make the hoax credible. Both possibilities have been argued extensively. Linear A is not a code exactly, but an undeciphered writing system, the script of the Minoan civilization of ancient Crete, used roughly from 1800 to 1450 BC. Linear B, a later Mycenaean Greek script derived from it, was decoded in 1952. Linear A has not been. We have hundreds of Linear A tablets. We know the script is related to Linear B. We know the approximate phonetic values of many of the symbols based on the Linear B parallels, and yet the language it encodes remains completely unknown. We can read the symbols. We don't know what they mean. The Minoans were a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization. They built palaces, traded across the Mediterranean, left substantial records. But what their records say, what their language was, what they thought and believed and argued about, sealed behind an undeciphered script. There's something about unsolved codes that I find uniquely compelling. Unlike most mysteries where the solution is lost or was never known, a code contains its solution. The answer is there. In the Voynich manuscript, in the Beale papers, in Linear A, the information exists and has survived. It's just like locked. Someone knew the key. The key existed. Maybe it still does somewhere unrecognized. The message is waiting. Your brain is running its own kind of encoding right now. The events of the day being processed, compressed, transformed into memory, patterns being recognized, information being filed or discarded. A process you have no conscious access to, the running underneath. The code of your own experience being written in a language you'll never fully read, which is fine. You don't need to read it. You just need to let it run. Rest now, the processing is happening. Whether you watch or not, in 1979, a researcher named Alexander Schoss painted a holding cell at a naval correctional facility in Seattle, a specific shade of pink. Not because it looked nice, because he had a theory. The color was a bubblegum pink he called Baker Miller pink after the facility's commanders, who agreed to test it. His theory was that the color had a measurable physiological effect, that it reduced muscle strength and aggressive behavior in ways that went beyond psychological association or personal preference. He tested it by having subjects stare at the pink card and then measured their grip strength. Grip strength dropped measurably after exposure. He repeated it. Same result. The naval facility reported reduced incidents of violence and erratic behavior in the holding cell. The finding spread through corrections facilities across the country. Pink holding cells became a thing for a while. The science turned out to be more complicated. Later attempts to replicate Schauss's grip strength finding failed when experimenters controlled for demand characteristics, the tendency of subjects to behave how they think the experimenter wants them to behave. The pink effect may be partially or largely psychological rather than involuntary. But the broader question his work opened, whether color has direct physiological effects on the human body and mind, has produced genuinely interesting findings. Red is the most studied color in this context. The findings are consistent enough to be worth taking seriously. people perform worse on cognitive tests when they're exposed to red before the test, specifically on tasks requiring analytical thinking and careful problem solving. Red appears to activate an avoidance motivation, a mental state associated with threat and caution that narrows attention and reduces exploratory thinking. The same color enhances performance on tasks requiring attention to detail and accuracy. If you need to proofread something carefully, a red folder apparently helps. If you need to brainstorm freely, it doesn't. Red also increases physical performance in some contexts. Athletes wearing red win more often than those wearing blue in direct competition sports. This has been documented in Olympic combat sports and in English football across decades of data. Whether this is because red increases the wearer's aggression and confidence, or because it intimidates opponents, or some combination, is debated. The effect is real enough to be statistically significant across large data sets. Blue has essentially the opposite profile from red in many studies. Blue environments are associated with increased creative performance on open-ended tasks. Blue appears to activate an approach motivation, a state associated with safety and exploration that broadens attention and encourages associative thinking. This is why creative agencies sometimes paint walls blue and tech companies default to blue interfaces. It's not just aesthetic preference. There's at least suggestive evidence that the color environment shapes the cognitive mode of the people working in it. Blue light is also the primary driver of the circadian disruption from screens. The short wavelength blue light emitted by phones and computers suppresses melatonin production. Your brain interprets blue light as daylight, as a signal that it's not time to sleep. Reducing blue light exposure in the evening is one of the most evidence-supported interventions for sleep quality, which means the color of your environment right now matters more than most people realize. Green has a different set of associations rooted in evolutionary history. Humans evolved in environments where green meant vegetation, water, life, safety. The savanna hypothesis suggests that humans have an innate preference for landscape features associated with ancestral survival, open grassland with trees, water visible, cover available. Green is part of that package. Those studies on recovery from stress and attention fatigue consistently show that exposure to natural environments, even photographs of natural environments, accelerates recovery. Hospital patients with window views of nature recover faster and require less pain medication than patients with views of walls. Those students who spend time in green spaces show better attention and working memory than those who don't. There's a Japanese practice called Shinrin-yoku, forest bathing. Simply spending time in forests. The research on it shows reductions in cortisol, blood pressure, and heart rate, and increases in natural killer cell activity in the immune system. The green environment is doing something physiological, not just psychological. Yellow is interesting for its relationship to attention. High contrast yellow-black combinations are used universally for warning signals, road signs, caution tape, hazard markers. This isn't arbitrary. The human visual system is particularly sensitive to this combination. It's the color of wasps, of certain venomous frogs, of warning coloration across nature. Yellow environments are associated with increased serotonin and elevated mood in some studies. They're also associated with increased anxiety at high saturation. Too much yellow can feel oppressive. The relationship between yellow and mental state is dose dependent. In a way, the other colors aren't quite as dramatically. What the color research suggests collectively is that the visual environment shapes mental and physiological state in ways that bypass conscious evaluation. You don't decide to feel more anxious in a red room or more creative in a blue one. It happens underneath the level of deliberate thought. The ancient instincts are still running. The associations between colors and environmental conditions. Red blood, blue sky, green safety, yellow warning. Those associations were built in over millions of years, and they don't turn off just because you're in a modern building that happens to be painted a particular color. The room you're in right now is probably dark. Dark is good. Dark is the color, or the absence of color, that the brain most clearly reads as sleep time. The visual system going quiet, the stimulation falling away. The darkness isn't nothing. It's a signal. One, your nervous system has been reading correctly every night of your life. It means rest. It means safe. It means now, in 1947, the behaviorist B.F. Skinner put hungry pigeons in a box.
Yeah.
The box delivered food at random intervals, regardless of what the pigeon was doing. Nothing the pigeon did had any effect on when the food arrived. The delivery was completely random. Within a few days, the pigeons had developed elaborate rituals. One pigeon was turning counterclockwise between deliveries, another was thrusting its head into the upper corner of the cage, another had developed a pendulum-like swinging motion, another was bobbing its head in a specific rhythm. Each pigeon had independently invented a behavior and was repeating it because the random food delivery had coincidentally followed the behavior once or twice. The pigeon's brain connected the behavior to the outcome, even though no connection existed. And once the connection was made, the behavior was reinforced every time food arrived, which happened eventually by chance, regardless of what the pigeon was doing. Though Skinner called it superstitious behavior, the pigeon had invented a ritual out of coincidence and was now following it religiously. The human version of this is not as different as we'd like to think. Superstitions emerge everywhere humans face uncertain outcomes. Sport is the most visible arena. Athletes perform elaborate pre-game rituals, specific music, specific sequences of putting on equipment, specific warm-up movements that they believe influence outcomes that are in reality determined by physical performance and chance. Wade Boggs ate chicken before every game for his entire 20-year baseball career. Michael Jordan wore his University of North Carolina practice shorts under his Bulls uniform for every NBA game he ever played. Rafael Nadal goes through an elaborate pre-serve ritual involving hair, nose, ear, and shoulder touches in a specific sequence that varies slightly depending on which ear he's serving to. None of these things affect the outcome in any direct causal way, and yet these are not stupid people. They're among the best performers in their fields. So what's happening? The function of ritual is not primarily to influence external outcomes, it's to regulate internal states. A study by Allison Wood Brooks at Harvard gave participants a difficult task, a performance they had to complete in front of evaluators and randomly assign them to perform a ritual beforehand or not. The ritual was arbitrary, drawing a picture of how they felt, sprinkling salt on it, counting to 5, meaningless. And yet, participants who performed the ritual reported lower anxiety and performed measurably better. The ritual created a sense of control, not real control over the outcome, the task was the same regardless, but psychological control over their own internal state. The deliberate sequence of actions gave the nervous system a signal that preparation had occurred, that the situation was managed, that it was safe to perform. That signal is pharmacologically active. It reduces cortisol, it lowers heart rate, it shifts the nervous system from threat response toward performance mode. The ritual isn't superstition in the sense of being irrational. It's an intervention in your own neurobiology dressed in arbitrary clothing. Anthropologists have documented ritual behavior in every human culture ever studied: birth rituals, death rituals, coming-of-age rituals, harvest rituals, healing rituals, war rituals. The specifics vary enormously. What the ritual involves, what it symbolizes, what powers it's believed to invoke, but the structure is universal. Deliberate, repeated behavior performed at moments of transition or uncertainty. The universality suggests ritual isn't a cultural invention, it's a human capacity, something the brain is built to do that cultures then elaborate in their particular directions. The anthropologist Victor Turner described ritual as a mechanism for managing liminality, the state of being between states, the threshold moments where the normal rules are suspended, where identity is in flux, where the outcome is uncertain. Ritual marks these moments. It creates a container for the uncertainty. It tells the nervous system that the transition is being handled. Compulsive ritual is the dark version of this. Obsessive compulsive disorder involves rituals that have escaped their regulatory function and taken over the checking, the counting, the specific sequences that must be completed before safety can be felt. These are the same mechanism running without a governor. The ritual that should discharge anxiety instead feeds it when it's not performed precisely correctly, generating more anxiety, requiring more ritual in an escalating loop, which illuminates something important about how the mechanism works. It works because the brain treats the completion of the ritual as evidence that the feared outcome has been prevented. Every time the ritual is completed and the feared thing doesn't happen, the connection between ritual and safety is reinforced. The pigeon gets its food. The behavior strengthens. The difference between adaptive ritual and compulsive ritual is whether the person can choose not to perform it without overwhelming anxiety, whether they're running the ritual or the ritual is running them. The bedtime routine is a ritual in the most literal sense. The sequence of actions that precedes sleep, brushing teeth, changing clothes, checking locks, lying down in a specific position, these are behaviors that have been paired with the outcome of sleep so many times that performing them becomes a cue. The nervous system learns that these actions mean sleep is coming. The sequence initiates the physiological preparation scenario when the routine is disrupted. Travel, stress, an unusual schedule, sleep often suffers, not entirely because the body doesn't know it's tired, because the cues that normally trigger the sleep cascade are missing. The ritual matters, not because it has magical properties, because your own nervous system has made it meaningful through repetition. You've probably done something tonight that you do every night, some sequence of small actions that precedes this moment. Your nervous system recognized them, it's already responding. The ritual worked the way it always works. Not magic, something better than magic, a signal you've been sending yourself every night of your adult life, and your body answering every time. A rest now, the signal has been received,